I think I'm going to start this off with a confession. I have to mention that a big part of why I play music is because I thought it was cool. My father is a musician. I grew up around a lot of musicians who were also my role models. I'm not entirely confident because I haven't really done any survey to confirm this, but if I had to guess, if you were to ask a lot of musicians why they started playing music, quite a few of them would probably say they also found it cool. Barring that, maybe they would say it's because they wanted other people to think that they were cool. Maybe some other people would also say that they found it fascinating or that they were just pushed into it by their family. But I'm actually kind of curious as to how common this idea of specifically being cool is, because the history of coolness is actually pretty complex. I know this isn't exactly scholarly, but the best example I could think of people asking a general audience why they wanted to become a musician was this ancient Quora post where Yvette asked, "Why did you become a musician?" I read through everything, and out of the roughly 70 responses I counted, 10 specifically mentioned being cool. That's about 14% in total. This doesn't seem like a lot, but I think we should probably also consider two things. One, a lot of people just said it was because they loved music or that it was their destiny to play music. While that sounds nice and decisive, it isn't actually an explanation of why they became a musician. They wouldn't have produced music from first principles if they were born and raised entirely isolated from society, so something must have influenced them. Given that, I think we can remove this more or less non-responsive or response from the pool. Once we do, it becomes more apparent that coolness is a major factor in people's motivations to play music. Additionally, if we consider that the proportion of people who cited attention-seeking as motivation may include people who thought that their potential audience would find them cool, the proportion of individuals may actually be higher, but those people didn't specifically use that wording, so I can't be entirely sure. So based on this crude survey, I think we could probably say somewhere between 14% and 32% of musicians got into playing specifically because they thought it would be cool. In my mind, that's actually a significant proportion, especially considering that the word cool is actually sort of a nebulous, indefinite adjective. The lowest hanging fruit here in terms of demonstrating that would be to begin by pointing out that it has a lot of definitions in the dictionary, but the nuance actually goes a lot deeper than that, and to explore it, we're going to have to step back in time a little. It's the 1990s. A college student is writing an essay about Christopher Columbus for their history class, where he mentions that the crew of the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria were given a festive welcome when they got back to Spain from the Americas. When grading, the professor marks this as incorrect, but the student protests. He goes to the professor and shows him a passage from his textbook where it states that Columbus received a cool reception upon arrival, not realizing that because the textbook is old, the author intended for cool to mean not warm, as in restrained. So how did the author leave things so unclear? Well, historically, it probably didn't seem so contradictory. People used to more commonly mean restrained or measured when they used the word cool. This text predates the common usage of it to refer to something that is very good or popular. The student, however, was not aware of the word's shift in meaning. While this seems like kind of a silly misunderstanding, he probably wouldn't be alone in making this mistake. So what happened? Why did its definition change? And did it ever mean something else to begin with? To answer those questions, we're going to have to go a lot further back, to 1789, or rather, the years just prior to 1789, and to France, which was a monarchy at that point. There was a lot going on in the country then. More and more people were moving to cities, and industrialism was starting to become more of a factor in the economy. The population was booming. All of this was leading to a lot of tensions in and over the government, which was increasingly being seen as incapable of managing the state effectively. A bunch of financial crises and famines had occurred, and on top of that, the French nobility and monarchists had become known for practicing this philosophy called Libertinism, which was pretty controversial at the time and arguably still is today. One of the key figures in the libertine movement was this nobleman who most people know today as Marquis de Sade. He's typically thought of as an author, and honestly, I can't even really get into what he wrote about it because this is YouTube and I don't want this video to be demonetized, but we would probably consider it to be not safe for work by today's standards. If you're more curious, you can Google him. There's a whole Wikipedia. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it here. Obviously, the content would be pretty graphic, and I'm trying to keep this somewhat family-friendly. While de Sade's writings were partially controversial due to their explicit content, there was a broader social criticism of his work at play as well. The characters in his stories, which were thought to be semi-autobiographical, partake in all kinds of crazy excess and hedonism at a time when the French people are starving and dying. This was really what was concerning to audiences. Advertising that rich people had access to all this debauchery looked bad. It made French rulers seem incredibly out of touch with what was going on in the cultural movement. Desade's work was so controversial that he was imprisoned by the French government in the years before the Revolution in an attempt to suppress the notion his behavior might be widespread among nobility, but nonetheless his literary career had an effect on the public's perception of people who held power over them, and that undoubtedly contributed to the eventual overthrowing of the feudal system in France in the years following his imprisonment. The new government that formed in the wake of Louis XVI's death was mostly composed of a growing class of individuals we today call the bourgeoisie. These individuals were mostly from wealthier backgrounds, and they had largely made their money through the increase in productivity that earlier industrialism had brought to manufacturing. Before, making goods typically involved a small shop of workers who produced things one at a time, largely without the intervention of machines. Now, goods were beginning to be made in factories making use of mechanical advantages offered by newly developed technology. The profits from these ventures had given the bourgeoisie the means to secure control of the state, but they were wary of the mistakes their predecessors, the feudal lords, had made in terms of cultural differentiation and excess. So rather than silo themselves and their preferences off from the main public sphere, the new ruling class quickly began billing themselves as much more measured, enlightened, and alternative to the libertine interests of the monarchy. Rather than be ruled by their emotional impulses, the governors of the new industrial age would instead need to be ruled by rational principles of science and good moral philosophy. They would need, from the top down, to construct a social standard of so-called good behavior so as to avoid setting themselves apart as a class. One of the first proving grounds for this scientific rationalism was the new industrial workspace these individuals found themselves in charge of managing. Suddenly, an employer may be responsible for dozens of employees. How does one go about coordinating the work so as to maximize the productivity of the factory and subsequently your profits? Early 19th century philosophers like Jeremy Bentham made some attempt to bridge this gap by addressing how the factory owner should relate to and ultimately control this growing population, but the question of work culture for the industrial age was not really solved until a guy named Frederick Winslow Taylor came along in the 1800s. Taylor, unlike a lot of his predecessors, was a factory manager who really understood the importance of managing the emotional state of his workers and himself in the name of keeping the factory operating. Whereas a lot of early principles of management had emphasized trying to use aggression and increase social tension to keep workers producing goods, Taylor realized that this actually increased the likelihood that workers would strike or retaliate, and they would do so more intensely if he himself treated the situation with anger or violence. So rather than approach these conflicts from a positioning of threatening punishment, Taylor framed the relationship between management and the worker as one of friendship. One of his 4 mandates states, "Cooperate with the men so as to ensure all of the work is done in accordance with the principles of the science which has been developed." And by this he means the manager should never appear to have lost control of himself or his willingness to work with his employees. Any ill will the worker perceives toward him doesn't affect him. Instead, the manager must always act as if they are willing to reach some sort of agreement. Therefore, if they are unable to, it seems it is only because the workers have antagonized the management, which itself is acting as if actions are irrelevant to the matter at hand. Whether this is true or not is not really of any concern. The point is to emotionally confuse the worker and redirect their anger towards a perceived flaw in the system rather than any one individual whose actions may have led to the flaw's existence. Taylor isn't really directly saying it, but the way he's describing the optimal attitude toward management is definitionally cool behavior by the 19th and even 20th century standards. His whole approach to conflict is to defer blame and show restraint. It's worth pointing out that he wasn't the first person to attempt this tactic. One account of a British corruption case from 1809 mentions the accused was sorry to observe that the generous, open, candid, and manly feelings of the honorable gentleman who brought forward the charges had been led away, so as to be prevailed on by the advice of cooler heads than his, and persons who meant more than he did, to fritter them down in the way that had been done by the motion of that night. Here the contrast is already being drawn between a less emotional, more rational, cool group and an emotional, less rational individual, but Taylor's approach to scientific management became the point where the idea of keeping a cooler head in the face of adversity or conflict crossed into popular culture. By the late 1800s, the concept of cooler heads prevailing was distinctly tied to the concept of a less emotional, rationally informed management keeping control over a more emotional, unruly working class. The State Journal of Jefferson City, Missouri, for example, states in one 1876 article, "Cincinnati is the scene of a great deal of discontent amongst the laboring classes. At the Esplanade a few days since, there were demonstrations that were painful and serious. Large crowds of unemployed laborers met and talked over their grievances. It was no sham of suffering, and though nothing came of it, a strong effort was made to inaugurate a bread riot. Bread or blood was the frequent cry, and thoughtful men looked on with pain and apprehension. The counsels of cooler heads prevailed, and no disturbances occurred." Another 1885 article in the Salt Lake Evening Democrat states, "A man from the Republican headquarters grabbed the garment, and after soaking it in kerosene oil, returned and burned the shirt in front of the Democratic headquarters. A crowd of several hundred gathered, and the greatest excitement prevailed. the council of cooler heads prevailed, and after much loud talk and threats, the crowd dispersed. There's no shortage of examples of these, and pretty much in every case, the cooler head in question is clearly implied to be a less emotional authority figure who is able to enforce a rationality over a given situation, leading to a dissolution and conflict. By the 1900s, this idea of coolness was explicitly a part of management philosophy. One mid-20th century management textbook insists, "It is of the utmost importance that the foreman remain cool." One of the consequences of this concept of power and a cool head becoming synonymous is that by the 1900s, the average working stiff, despite not really being in a position of power, also wants to be seen as cool. This is the result of a fulfillment of a goal for industrial capitalism, to project a cultural standard that people in the working class aspire to rather than criticize means people envy the ruling class more so than resent them. One of the most convenient consequences of this particular universal culture, however, is that coolness is an ineffective emotional practice for the working class. Its practitioners fail to realize that it's the power wielded by the managerial class that enabled them to act disaffected, not that disaffection granted them the power. Wielding power grants you the ability to act cool, not vice versa. Nevertheless, by the 1950s, this desire for coolness had begun to slide into popular culture and counterculture alike, and in the process, our idea of what cool is kind of changed. But, and this is important, it also kind of didn't. Following World War II, the emerging American middle class had more leisure time and money to spend, and with that, a youth culture-based economy started to appear. Many of the celebrities of this era projected a strong disaffection and nonchalance that at that point had become known specifically as cool, and the youth of that generation, as a result, were some of the first to aspire to be cool themselves in a more modern sense. This shift into our current notion of coolness occurred in part because the pop culture industry borrowed aesthetics and imagery heavily from marginalized people in the process of constructing a model. This was mostly done to adopt the perceived artistic and aesthetic legitimacy of people from those backgrounds for commercial purposes, but one other consequence of this is that coolness became projected onto marginalized aesthetics as an associated emotional state. Take Elvis, for example. As a white man trained to perform blues music by black musicians, his public persona was carefully crafted to make him seem like he never really cared all that much. His famous catchphrase was, "Thank you very much," and it's always delivered in a kind of surprisingly hushed, unexcited voice, almost grunted. This attitude is really a sharp contrast to the emotional space of the music he played, which was very intense and expressive and reflected an African American tradition that was deeply in touch with and outgoing in regard to emotion. Miles Davis is another musician of that era who had a strange relationship with coolness. His 1957 compilation by Capitol Records was titled The Birth of the Cool. It featured songs from the previous 15 years that were retroactively considered part of the birth of a new genre, cool jazz. Characterized by a more laid-back, quieter approach than bebop, the style quickly grew popular, and in the process, many began to associate Miles Davis with the concept of coolness, which at this point is starting to mean more than just restrained because it's increasingly part of youth fashion. It's also starting to mean good or aesthetically popular. From this we get the modern sense of the term, cool as in fashionable or popular, but it's also important to realize that we also kind of never really lost the original definition either. The cool of youth culture has always been about being too cool, about acting like you don't care about things, about pretending like things don't affect you. It still is. It's not cool to be vulnerable. And here's the thing about Miles Davis. He wasn't cool. He was actually extremely uptight, controlling, and emotional. Elvis was too. If they ever acted like that, it was always just that, an act. Pretending like you didn't care was just seen as a power move because that's how people in power at the time handled themselves. Both these people cared about things, especially their craft, deeply. They were very dedicated to their music. Recognizing that, I think, brings me to the title of this video. Why should you not try to be cool? Well, I guess what I'm saying here is that being cool has kind of always been about controlling yours and other people's emotions for the purposes of keeping both yourself and others docile and exploitable. People who are worried about seeming cool don't take risks, they don't think critically about their emotions, they are too worried about what other people will do to do things that are actually creative or interesting. The end result of closing yourself off from a lot of emotional and creative experience in the name of approval of your peers is just that you become less curious about the world. This generates a feedback loop where you just become more and more dependent upon the approval of others for personal validation, and that's not going to help you progress as an artist. You have to remain open and vulnerable to everything, every emotional experience, every conflict, every possibility. Lots of musicians project an aura of coolness, but that has a lot more to do with an extant power structure and the culture of celebrity and marketing than it does with who they are as people. You, as a musician, have nothing to gain from being cool. Coolness is all about complicity to a set of social norms that you want nothing to do with. You want to be able to move outside of those norms, and that's the space where you're going to develop your own unique approach to playing, your own unique voice, your own act. So, good luck with that. I hope that you find your path.